So as the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, what do you think is the major impact of the Milligan case? And how does that change how you all organize Black voters?
First, thank you, Congresswoman, for putting this together and for your consistent work. I heard on the last panel how they referred to you taking up the torch that, your friend and mentor, John Lewis, left behind. And so thank you for all that you've been doing on this issue and so many other issues. I think I have to kind of pick up where Terry left off. Because while certainly the decision was unexpected and it's certainly a victory, right, in one very obvious sense, there's two cautionary notes. One being the fact that the Supreme Court could have decided this last year before the midterm elections took place, right? And so, in effect, what they essentially did was it was a supreme stall tactic to let what they knew at that time were racist maps, were undemocratic maps, to be used in the midterm elections to impact Alabama's elections, to impact Louisiana's elections, to impact not just one, but 2, 3, 4 seats in Florida and a seat in Georgia. That literally determined the shape of power in Congress. And so for that reason, we talk about justice delayed and justice denied. This is very much a case of justice delayed. The second reason it's a cautionary note is because, as you've pointed out, what they've done now is send it right back to the great state of Alabama and the legislature, the same ones that came up with gerrymandered maps, to now have to correct themselves, to now have to police themselves. And it's really not clear, because what the Supreme Court did not make clear is really what do they mean when they talk about vote dilution? Like, what do we really mean when we talk about minority districts or black majority districts? There's really no guarantee that we're going to come up with 2 majority black districts. In fact, we really even need to have a conversation about what does that mean? Because you got some folks, even supposed allies of the black community, saying, oh, we don't need majority black. We just need black opportunity. So I don't know about y'all. I travel all across this country in what we call the blackest bus in America, talking to black communities, and we're not talking about just opportunity. We're talking about power. We're talking about actual power. And so, this conversation about, we just want a black opportunity districts, that's not what the battle was for, right? That's not what this movement in Birmingham was for and Selma was for. And so, from our perspective as Black Voters Matter, we're going to continue to engage our communities to talk about this issue of power and what we expect to come out of these new maps, to talk about even beyond, this particular map. We really need to even have a broader conversation around, what does fair representation look like? There's discussions that Lonnie Guinier tried to have with this country 30 years ago about proportional representation that didn't get the hearing it should have got then, but if it did, we might not be in the situation we're in now, because we have to radically rethink, what does fair representation even look like in a Congress? It's not written in stone that Congress looked the way that it looks right now. Right? And so we have to radically reimagine what representation looks like, because at the end of the day, while we have to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act through the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, but we have to think more radically about how we reform this democracy even beyond our traditional notions of voting rights and our traditional notions of civil rights. That's not as a replacement to these battles over voting rights, right? But it is to think more radically and more broadly around what it means to reshape our very notions of this democracy. Because I'm here to tell you, they're thinking radically about how to reshape it every day, right? They're thinking radically about how to make it radically undemocratic every day. In Ohio right now, there's about to be a referendum around whether or not state referendums get decided by a 50% vote, or does it go to 60%? Right? Like the filibuster that y'all were just discussing. That's radically undemocratic. But they're not shy. They are unapologetic about how they are attacking democracy and voting rights. And we have to be just as unapologetic in the spirit of love about advancing this democracy.
Very good. You brought up all of us have to be engaged in that effort. And Cliff, I'm asking you, because you're representing Black Voters Matter and we do matter, how do we have our voices heard in this process of coming up with a new map?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that, because we actually, much the way Evan was talking about, in several states, part of what we did during the redistricting process was to have community forums and to provide software where folks could actually participate in creating their own maps, and not just at the congressional level, even at the local level, right? What do you think is a fair map in your city council districts, right? And so that process has to continue now, especially has continued now, because as we've all said, this has got to be a process where everybody is feeling attached, everybody is letting their voice be heard, everybody is providing feedback. And so it's incumbent, and it's really a testimony to what we know about our movements in history, right? We need a combination of strategies. We need a legal strategy, right? But we also need an organizing strategy. And things work best when those things go together. A lot of people talk about the Montgomery bus boycott like it was just a boycott that ended segregation on the Montgomery buses, but there was a whole case that made it to the Supreme Court, Browder versus Gale, which was what actually legally ended it, but it would not have happened without the bus boycott happening simultaneously, right? And so we've got to be doing these legal cases and litigation, but we also got to be organizing our folks. There were a couple just real quick points I wanted to make to Jerome's point, and several people have touched on this, because I actually, and we have what some may consider a controversial position, because we think certainly Black voting age population is a starting point, but that's not really enough for all the reasons that Marcia was talking about, right? So really we have to look at what does actual turnout numbers look like to really decide what's what's a registration number like? Because at the end of the day, some people say, and I say it's controversial because they say, well, you're trying to reward your community that's not voting enough, right? But when we know that there are structural reasons that Marcia was talking about why we're not, it's not just that we sitting on the couch and we just not motivated. We talked about, Doug Jones talked about the voter ID. There's the felony disenfranchisement. There's the economic reasons. There's all these things. So when you know those barriers exist, just looking at the voting age population isn't even enough. Right, but it is a potential starting point. And then the last thing I just want to say quickly, and it's not a small point, because you talked about how you're an impacted party in all this, and that's not a small point, because it would be easy, and there have been representatives, congressional or otherwise, local level, who in some of these discussions they'll accept the status quo because they'd rather be in a 70% safe district. You know that your district, once you say that there's going to be 2 black districts, that means I might lose some folks but you have been a champion on this issue in this state and otherwise. And that's not a small thing, and I didn't want to bypass that.
Yes, please.
I'm not an attorney, but as you know, I'm married.
But you're married to one.
A pretty good one.
A family of attorneys, actually.
That's right. And so I think it's notable that, again, it's a victory, right? But there's 3 justices that said, yeah, this makes sense. That state legislatures have no checks and balances, right? And these are 3 judges that call themselves like originalists and all that. They want to go back to the original intent and all that. But they were willing to ignore over 300 years of precedent that legislative actions, state legislative actions, are subject to review and checks and balances. And so again, it's a sign of just how far some are willing to go. And in this case, it was only 3 of them. But I'd be remiss if I didn't offer that part of this discussion around voting rights at some point has got to include a discussion around court reform, particularly Supreme Court reform, and whether that's expansion of the court, which I support and our organization supports, or whether that's term limits, ethics rules, whatever. Right now, we have a Supreme Court that really answers to nobody. And I think, the elephant in the room with some of these decisions is we're not sure that these decisions would have gone the same way if we had not just gone through 2 months of controversy around how corrupt this court, and
Unethical.
particularly some members of this court, have been, and how much it's hurt by not having ethics, and how much, and again, this isn't partisan, this is just a objective reality. Most people in the country don't view this as a legitimate court because of many of these scandals, and so we're not sure how much of this is in response to that, really.
Cliff?
So real quick, just on the fair representation question, the only thing I'm going to add is, and this might be adding another area of work, but part of fair representation is that you have the ability for those that represent you to actually do their job. And what we are seeing is a wave of, whether you call it preemption or some of the other tactics, we're seeing a wave of where some folk are saying, okay, yeah, you can register, yeah, you can vote, yeah, you can actually win the election, but we are not going to let your city govern itself. We're not going to let your mayor govern itself. Whether that's Birmingham not being able to do living wage, or whether it's Jackson, Mississippi, right? We're seeing a wave of this, and that's not fair representation, right? Nor is it actually having actual voting rights. On terms of what I want those watching this to take away, three things very quickly. One, this work has got to be done throughout the year. It can't just, in every year. There's no such thing as an off year. I'm glad to see this panel even happening in what some people look at as an off year, an odd number year. It's got to be done 365 days out of the year, and we've got to support groups that do that work. Secondly, coalition or the lack of coalition is not an option. Right. I'm so glad that Terry's here, and our friends from MALDEF were here, and from North Early, the indigenous communities. I believe, and our organization believes, as Dr. King says, that we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, right? And so coalition is a must. And then lastly, and this touches on what Evan was saying, most importantly, what I want folks to leave here with is belief. We have got to believe that a better world is possible. We've got to believe that victory is possible. Several folks today have talked about how we are sitting in a sacred space. And it's sacred not just because of what happened to those 4 little girls. It's sacred because of what preceded that. Yes. That children, to Evan's point, young folk in this city met right here, left from here to Kelly Ingram Park, and changed the history of this city, this state, and this country. Armed with nothing else other than their belief that something was wrong in Birmingham, something was wrong in this country, and that they somehow, at 6, 7, 8, or 18, that they had the power to correct it. So if they can have that belief and change this country, certainly those of us watching this right now can believe we've got the power to change voting rights and change the shape of this democracy.
Cliff Albright, Black Voters Matter.